Okay, let's have another slide. Next slide. This is the third package for the guidelines. The first one was about routes. The second was about linear elements. This is about point elements. Next slide. Professor Jamros or Professor Gaca did not indicate that we had some information from surveys about which elements in the designs were considered to be incorrect, and we have the conclusions from it. We have three elements that were often indicated, that there are no principles for installing and choosing to install pedestrian crossings, that there should be more devices on pedestrian crossing or suggested pedestrian crossings, and there should be more precise definitions of visibility. As for the content, in addition to classic elements, such as this type of project should have, I'll just emphasize the ones which are highlighted in the red. Design procedure, location and selection of point infrastructure, field of vision of the pedestrians, and alternative devices assisting road crossing. Now, why do we have to change the way of thinking? For years, we were assuming that an unprotected user is very sensitive, and we have to protect them at all costs. And the way to do it, the main idea, was to build zebra crossing. We started building as many zebra crossings as we could. As Professor Wawrzonek said, we had more zebras than the Serengeti. And there is something to it, except that we ended up with very many zebra crossings. And there were attempts to improve safety, even on zebra crossing, by adding red background, lights, cat lamps. There was insufficient supervision over speed, insufficient supervision over parking, no visibility requirements, literally, practically, and quite broad cross-section, hence high speeds. So we end up in a situation where pedestrians say that they should feel safe the moment they put their foot on the zebra crossing, and yet very often the driver has no chance to see such a pedestrian and to brake and stop in time. It is not easy to create a simple procedure for the selection of the type of pedestrian crossing, because there are very many important factors, significant factors. If we build a matrix, it would be a 7-dimensional matrix. We're talking about such determinants as the actual speed of vehicles, length of the crossing, visibility, vehicle volume, pedestrian volume, effectiveness, namely what sort of delays could be caused by traffic lights or any other right-of-way privilege, both for the pedestrians and for the drivers. And the characteristics of the pedestrians should be considered, because we have different levels of mobility. We use 4 basic criteria that we need to be used in design. We're talking about safety, efficiency, convenience, and accessibility. I'm not going to discuss them because they had been mentioned in previous presentations. The main process in design is a certain preparation before design starts. We often heard from road managers and designers, please give us some principles of design. Hence, that's why we create the draft guidelines. One of the messages that I have to all the parties interested is that in order to use this, you will have to run measurements, not only with regards to vehicles, but also to the pedestrians. You have to, therefore, as in the graphs, it says in the graph, define the area and the context, run the analysis, define planning requirements, collect data for design. Then you have to select the places, then you design, and then you have all the areas related to maintenance and audit. Some classification for pedestrian crossings have been adopted because we divided them roughly into pedestrian crossings and alternative solutions. Pedestrian crossings is everything we know, except for those elements that I marked in red. Extended platforms, that's an unknown to us part of a device at pedestrian crossings, and the other three are alternative, suggested crossing, sideway pavements, and neutral lanes. Now, why do we even think about alternative ways for crossing the roads? It's because we hit the wall. We're using all of the devices, but they stop working. There are too many pedestrian crossings. If in 1/4 of pedestrian crossings we are forced to use additional non-standard devices, then an ordinary pedestrian crossing that does not have all the bells and whistles is perceived as less important, therefore could increase the risk. So suggested pedestrian crossings effectively affect the behavior of the pedestrian. They make sure they can, to a larger extent, they make sure that they can cross. Also, from the point of view of the driver, we have so many pedestrian crossings. Can the drivers really maintain full attention and focus when they run through a pedestrian crossing every 80 meters? We also have the certain directness. Every one of us has to ask themselves a question. When I walk around my own district where I live, my own neighborhood, do I actually cross the street where I want, or do I go all the way to the pedestrian crossing? And if I walk where I want, do I feel threatened? Alternative devices, in this case especially suggested crossings. Here's an element where we propose that there could be used here. We have good visibility from the point of view of pedestrian. 20 kilometers, this is where it's good visibility, it's 20 kilometers an hour. No limitations, 30 kilometers an hour where there's no more than 35 pedestrian per hour, 50 kilometers only if it's below 25 pedestrian per hour, and 70 for 15.
Wprowadzona została w końcu widoczność w obszarze przejścia dla pieszych 1 metr krawędzi przejścia. To jest
1 meter off the edge of the pedestrian crossing is going to be introduced after we change the regulations. You see here the issue of visibility at the in the vicinity of the pedestrian crossing. It's the pedestrian that has to see in a suggested crossing. It is the pedestrian who has to give way to the car. We noticed that there are many infrastructure errors in the location of bus stops in the driveway. So in the draft guidelines, we suggested very specific indications of how these should be located. What should be the relative distance of pedestrian crossing from bus stops? Next slide, please. This is something that I call the part or the backbone of the guidelines. This is where we get to choose the type of pedestrian crossing. Previously, it was difficult. Here, this is a simplification. Roads A and S, that means that we have to have non-collision crossings. The second one is dual carriageway other than A and S, plus 2+1 and 2 out of 2 and 2 out of 3. If it's over 70 kilometers an hour, then it must be non-collision or impossible to cross. If it's 70 or below, it has to be traffic lights. And all the other ones fall in the next category, where we have certain conditions which are related to either speed or visibility. If we follow the block diagram, if the car velocity is above 70, we look at a nomogram.
jest zrealizowany inny. Tutaj w zależności od tego mamy wybór przejście
That is for 90, and it's either no crossing or non-collision. If the velocity is
mniejsza niż 70, to
equal or lower than 70, then we drop down to the next block.
sprawdzamy, czy większa niż 50,
We see if it's more than 50.
sprawdzamy, czy
So if it's between 50 and 70, we check for visibility,
prędkości 50 i mniej.
or we drop below 50, and then we're on the right-hand side of the chain block diagram. We check if there's visibility. If there is no visibility, then it's traffic lights. If yes, then we go to the next slide.
Tak, tutaj mamy tą dolną część
Zostało
slajdu.
już niewiele czasu.
You don't have a lot of time left.
Tutaj mamy
Parę
drugą
sekund.
Just a few seconds.
część slajdu. Tutaj nomogramów mamy.
You can see the nomograms giving you a choice between no crossing, suggested crossing, ordinary crossing, or traffic lights crossing. And the next one.
Pokazane są przejścia
What we see here is marked and suggested crossings, and we show them in the form of a catalog.
One wyglądają bardzo podobnie.
These elements look very similar, except that there is no zebra painted.
Zupełnie różne. To bardzo
But the place where they will be located are very different.
Na końcu wytycznych mamy
At the end of the guidelines, we have a little catalog of comprehensive solutions. For instance, a crossroads showing you how you can connect all the elements into whole sets, and a summary. What's important? Visibility from the point of view of the driver, from the point of view of the pedestrian, ordinary pedestrian crossings only under 50 kilometers per hour, crossing with traffic lights only up to 70, and we want to have more suggested crossings, and we want to have the tools to use them. And the last slide is thank you very much for your attention. There are questions, please ask.